I returned to my Chicago penthouse early for lunch. Through the glass-bottom infinity pool, I saw my wife, Christina, and my son-in-law Joshua in an embrace that shattered 30 years of trust. I didn't scream. I simply went to my private workshop and fetched a canister of industrial aircraft adhesive. I placed it on the nightstand. Its bright red, danger, extreme adhesive, not for human use, label hidden in plain sight. I knew that in their feverish haste, they wouldn't bother to read the fine print. I reported a chemical spill to building management for legal cover, then locked the bedroom door. Real justice is not an explosion, it is an accounting. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who is witnessing this journey with me. I walked down to the kitchen, my movements fluid and precise, the same way I used to navigate a boardroom before a hostile takeover. The penthouse was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the infinity pool's filtration system. I opened the industrial refrigerator and pulled out the remains of a meatloaf Christina had prepared the night before. I sliced the bread with a serrated knife, the rhythmic shing-shing sound of the blade, providing a steady tempo to my thoughts. 30 years of marriage were resting on that counter, and I was about to consume them with a side of Dijon mustard. I didn't feel my heart racing. I didn't feel the heat of a betrayed husband's rage. Instead, I felt the cool, sterile clarity of a flight instructor watching a student pilot stall an engine. I knew exactly what was about to happen next. I had calculated the bond time of that aircraft adhesive down to the minute. It was designed to hold the fuselage of a Boeing 747 together at 30,000 feet. On human skin, in a humid bedroom, its effect would be absolute. I took the first bite of my sandwich just as the first sound drifted down the spiral staircase. It was a muffled, confused yelp. Christina! Then came the deeper, more frantic voice of Joshua, my architect son-in-law, a man who prided himself on his structural integrity. The yelps quickly evolved into sharp, high-pitched shrieks of genuine terror. Furniture began to scrape against the hardwood floor upstairs, thuds and crashes that suggested a desperate, clumsy struggle. I chewed slowly, focusing on the texture of the meat and the tang of the mustard. My wife was screaming for help, pleading for someone to call 911. Joshua's voice had dropped into a repetitive loop of profanities that would have made my daughter, Madison, rethink her marriage choice. I reached for the phone on the kitchen wall. When the dispatcher answered, I kept my tone perfectly level, a masterclass in controlled concern. I told her I had just returned from a walk to find my master suite barricaded, and sounds of distress coming from within. I mentioned a potential chemical spill from my private workshop, knowing that would bring the heavy hitters. Within 12 minutes, the luxury of our Lakeshore Drive penthouse was shattered. The elevator doors opened to a team of Chicago's finest firefighters and the building's panicked management. I met them in the foyer, the half-eaten sandwich still sitting on the granite island behind me. I played the role of the confused, aging retiree with clinical perfection. My hands didn't shake. They wrung together in an appropriate display of worry. I told the lead firefighter that I had locked the heavy oak bedroom door from the outside and engaged the deadbolt because I thought I heard intruders. I claimed I was trying to preserve a crime scene until help arrived. The firefighters didn't hesitate. They swung a heavy Halligan tool, and the reinforced wood gave way with a splintering crack that echoed through the penthouse like a gunshot. The scene they found inside would become neighborhood legend. Christina and Joshua were not just caught, they were fused. The industrial adhesive had created a permanent, agonizing bridge between their bodies. The exothermic reaction of the aircraft resin had already begun to sear their skin, causing second-degree chemical burns that would require extensive grafting to repair. The look of utter mortification on their faces as the firefighters burst in lasers and flashlights illuminating their betrayal was worth every penny of the $9,200,000 I had once used to bail out. Madison's failing venture capital fund. Christina shot me a look of pure, concentrated venom through her tears, but I simply tilted my head, the picture of a shocked and heartbroken husband. As the sirens faded into the distance, and the penthouse returned to a hollow ringing silence after I had given my formal statement to the police, supported by the security footage of me discovering the barricaded door, I sat on my balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline. The cold wind from Lake Michigan whipped against my face, but I didn't feel the chill. I was too busy reviewing the ledger of my life. For 30 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. I had provided the capital, the security, and the reputation, while Christina and Madison managed the emotional assets. Now I realized it had been a subscription service, and I was the only one footing the bill. I looked at a framed photo on the side table, a younger version of us at the launch of my first aviation firm. Back then, I believed that loyalty was a contract written in blood. I didn't realize my compassion was merely a luxury they'd been overdrafting for years. When our daughter Madison came to me 3 years ago, tears in her eyes, begging for help with her venture capital fund, I didn't hesitate. I transferred $9,200,000 into her accounts. I didn't do it for the return on investment. I did it because that's what a father does. She didn't say thank you. She looked at me with the clinical detachment of a mechanic looking at a failing engine. To her, I wasn't a parent. I was a legacy system that needed to be decommissioned. People often wonder how a man who built a global aviation empire could be so passive in his own home. They see a husband who lets his wife dismiss his opinions, and a father who is treated like an automated teller machine, and they call it weakness. I call it the prison without bars. It is the invisible chain of the survivor. For decades, I lived in a state of learned helplessness, a psychological cage where you convince yourself that enduring mistreatment is the only way to keep the structure from collapsing. I stayed quiet to protect Christina's image. I stayed quiet to ensure Madison's success. I convinced myself that being useful was a valid substitute for being loved. But my silence wasn't a breakdown. It was a survival strategy. In aviation, you learn that when an engine stalls, you don't panic. You stabilize the aircraft, you check your instruments, and you wait for the right altitude to restart. I was simply at a holding pattern, waiting for the moment they revealed their true trajectory. They mistook my patience for decline. They thought that because I had retired from the boardroom, I had lost my ability to identify a hostile threat. They viewed my routine, my oatmeal, my quiet walks, my workshop time, as the slow fading of a mind that once commanded thousands. They were wrong. I wasn't fading, I was observing. I was documenting the frequency of Joshua's visits and the sudden illnesses that kept Christina home from her auditing jobs. My silence was the quiet of a hunter in a blind, watching his prey grow comfortable in their arrogance. The gilded cage wasn't built around me, it was built around them. They were the ones trapped by their own greed, convinced that the man who had out-negotiated industry titans for 40 years would be easily discarded like an old piece of furniture. I wasn't just a husband or a father anymore. I was the architect of their downfall, and I was finally ready to sign off on the plans. The emergency vehicles eventually pulled away, leaving the Chicago pavement wet and silent under the streetlights. I didn't go to the hospital. There was no need to witness the physical peeling apart of two people who had already torn my life to pieces. Instead, I went to Christina's desk in the small alcove off the master suite. It was a space usually off-limits to me, a boundary I had respected out of a misplaced sense of marital etiquette. But that contract was void now. In the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of high-end auditing reports, I found a glossy manila folder. The gold lettering on the front read, Sunrise, Senior Living Solutions. I opened it. It wasn't just a brochure. It was an intake file. Inside were notes dated 3 weeks before the pool incident notes in Christina's own handwriting. They had been documenting my supposed episodes. Patient displays increased irritability regarding household expenses, one note read. Exhibits repetitive behaviours in his workshop. Possible early onset cognitive decline. I stared at the words, my eyes tracing the loops of her cursive. They were pathologizing my autonomy. My refusal to fund another round of Joshua's failed architectural ventures was being labelled as paranoia. My desire to spend my retirement in my workshop, building something with my own hands, instead of flying to another meaningless gala, was being called social withdrawal. Then I found the legal draft. It was a petition for involuntary guardianship. Madison's firm, the one built on $9,200,000 of my sweat, had provided the legal template. The plan was surgical. They intended to have me declared non-competent. Once the court granted Christina control, she and Madison would have immediate access to my remaining aviation stocks, shares worth over $12,500,000. They weren't just cheating in the pool, they were constructing a warehouse for my soul. They wanted me alive, but legally silenced. They wanted to strip me of my citizenship and my humanity, so they could liquidate my legacy to bail out Madison's failing venture capital fund and Joshua's over-leveraged lifestyle. They viewed me as a liability that needed to be moved into a high-cost storage unit. The cost was listed at $4,700 a month. That was nearly twice my apparent pension. They had already calculated that my limited savings would cover the first year, before they were forced to sell the penthouse and my stocks to continue my care. It was a perfect, closed-loop financial murder. I sat in the dark of the penthouse, the silence of the city pressing against the glass. Anger wasn't the word for what I felt. It was too small, too human. I felt a profound sense of realignment. I had been playing the role of the aging father, the retired chief executive officer, the generous husband. But they had rewritten my character into a tragedy. They thought they were the auditors. But they had missed the most important asset on the balance sheet. They had forgotten that a man who spent his life ensuring the safety of aircraft never leaves anything to chance. My cognitive decline was about to become their professional collapse. I picked up the folder and walked to my workshop. It was time to prepare for the family meeting. I called the family meeting for 7 o'clock on Friday evening. I wanted them in my space, under my lights, where every flicker of guilt could be indexed. Christina and Joshua arrived together, both of them moving with a stiff, guarded gait. The bandages beneath their designer clothes were visible, a physical manifestation of the bond I had forced upon them. My daughter, Madison, was already there, pacing the length of the floor-to-ceiling windows, her phone a permanent extension of her hand. She looked at me not with love, but with the calculating eye of a vulture waiting for a heart to stop beating. "David, we've spoken with our legal team," Christina began, her voice brittle. She tried to summon her senior auditor authority, but it was difficult while sitting gingerly on a therapeutic cushion. "What you did with that adhesive, it's criminal. It's elder abuse. We could have you arrested." Joshua moved to sit next to her, avoiding my gaze entirely. "I was just assisting her, David. She had a severe, dizzy spell by the pool, a panic attack. I was helping her to the suite when the accident happened. We think the maintenance staff must have left that glue in the wrong bottle. It's a massive liability issue for the building." I sat across from them, my hands folded over my knee. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show them the fire they expected. I simply tapped the screen of my phone, ensuring the voice recorder was capturing every syllable of their revisionist history. Their gaslighting was a poor investment. They were trying to sell me a narrative I had already shorted. Watching them, I realized they were all trapped in the illusion of power in an empty wallet. This is a common psychological collapse among those who live off the secondary wealth of others. Christina, Joshua, and even Madison had forgotten a fundamental law of accounting. Status is not an internal value, it is a rented asset. They walked through Chicago with their heads high, convinced that the respect they received was for their character. In reality, that respect was a subscription service I was footing the bill for. They were psychological bankrupts masquerading as titans, unaware that when the primary investor withdraws his support, the entire facade of their elite lives dissolves into nothingness. "I'm done with the pool story," I said, my voice clinical and final. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the manila folder from Sunrise Senior Living. I slid it across the mahogany table until it tapped against Christina's knee. "Let's discuss the warehouse instead. Let's talk about the memory care unit Madison toured last Tuesday and the falsified psychiatric evaluation doctor Miller signed in exchange for a consultation fee from your venture fund." The room went ice cold. Madison stopped pacing. Christina's face transitioned from a performative flush to a deathly, ashen grey. "We were just worried, Dad," Madison stammered, her venture capitalist confidence evaporating. "Your behaviour has been erratic." "My behaviour has been observant," I corrected her. "You wanted to declare me non-competent to fund your failing startup, Madison. You wanted to strip me of my autonomy so you could liquidate my aviation stocks. You didn't realise that in your rush to audit my mind, you left the most important evidence on your own desk. This isn't a family meeting anymore. It's a liquidation of assets." "You all thought I was a line item that needed to be erased from the budget," I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls of the penthouse. "You looked at my $4,500 pension and saw a man who was barely solvent. You looked at my $4,500 monthly draw, a controlled allowance I deliberately capped to monitor the depth of your greed, and saw a man who was barely solvent. You were so blinded by your own perceived superiority that you didn't bother to check the structural integrity of the man you were trying to demolish." I opened my leather briefcase, the one I used when I closed the deal for the Mid-Atlantic corridor, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a certified bank statement from a private wealth firm in Zurich. "This is my inheritance from my Uncle Edmund. $15,500,000 received 8 years ago. I placed it in a separate, non-marital trust the day the check cleared. In the state of Illinois, separate property remains separate as long as it isn't commingled with marital assets. I never spent a cent of it on our joint expenses. I never used it to pay for this penthouse. Every dollar I gave you for your venture fund, Madison, came from my own liquid labour. This trust, it's an untouchable asset." Christina's eyes were fixed on the bottom line. Her hands, usually so steady with an auditing pen, were visibly shaking. She reached for the statement, but I pulled it back with a sharp clinical movement. "Don't bother auditing it, Christina. It's ironclad. And while you and Madison were busy trying to pathologize my retirement to steal my aviation stocks, you missed the most important move on the board. You were so focused on the sunset of my mind that you failed to see the sunrise of your own legal destruction." I turned my gaze to Joshua. He looked like a pilot realizing his landing gear won't deploy. "I know about the data leaks, Joshua. Using your contract to redesign our corporate server hubs as a Trojan horse to bypass our firewalls was your first mistake. I've known for 3 months that you've been selling my old proprietary flight safety protocols and logistics algorithms to our competitors in the Middle East. You thought tanking my portfolio was the final step in your acquisition of my life." Joshua tried to speak, but his voice was a strangled rasp. "David, that's not what happened. I was just consulting." "You were committing federal corporate espionage," I interrupted, sliding a second folder across the table. It was filled with encrypted chat logs and transaction identification codes, all meticulously recovered and verified by a third-party forensic audit firm I hired months ago. You see, I liquidated all my aviation holdings 6 months ago. I moved everything into the trust. I am completely out of the market. The data you've been leaking is technically useless to me now, but it's still protected under federal law. You were selling stolen air, Joshua, but the paper trail you left while doing it? That is a permanent record." The silence that followed was the kind of absolute vacuum you only find at 40,000 feet. Joshua looked at Madison, but she had already retreated into herself, her venture capitalist brain finally calculating the true cost of their betrayal. They hadn't just lost a father or a husband. They had walked into a trap designed by a man who had spent 40 years predicting every possible failure point in a system. Joshua wasn't just a cheating son-in-law anymore. He was a federal liability with no way out. Accounting is a beautiful discipline, I whispered. It always balances in the end. And right now, according to my ledger, you three are sitting at a total loss. The legal proceedings were less of a negotiation and more of a controlled demolition. My attorney moved with surgical precision, ensuring that the evidence of Christina and Joshua's conspiracy was entered into the public record before a settlement could even be discussed. In the eyes of the state of Illinois, the penthouse, the stock portfolio, and the $9,200,000 trust were separate assets held in a legal vessel that no auditor could breach. Christina sat at the long conference table, her professional mask finally shattered. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for a scrap of the legacy I had built. "David, we were married for 30 years, she whispered. "Surely I deserve more than a suitcase and a car." I didn't answer with emotion. I answered with a ledger. I slid 2 checks across the polished wood. The first was for $7,300, exactly half of our joint checking account after the initial legal retainers were settled. The second check was for exactly $1. I had signed it with the same fountain pen I used to finalize my retirement. The memo line on that second check read, "For services rendered. Your compassion was a luxury you overdrafted for years," I said, my voice as clinical as a forensic audit. "Now I realize our relationship was a subscription service, and I'm simply choosing not to renew. This isn't revenge, it is accounting." I handed her a copy of the formal eviction notice. "The trust that owns this penthouse has terminated your residency. However, I've used your own diligent research to secure you a place elsewhere. Your bags have already been delivered to the very Sunrise Memory Care Unit you picked out for me. Since you've already filled out the intake forms in my name, the facility was happy to accept a family relocation under the same contract. I was the sole trustee, and I had decided to liquidate the domestic assets. The power flip was absolute. The woman who had shopped for memory care units to warehouse me was now standing in a home she no longer had a legal right to inhabit. I stood on the glass balcony of the penthouse as the cold Chicago wind whipped past. Below, I watched the elite of my family tree wither. Joshua, favouring his injured leg, was loading boxes into the back of a used sedan. Christina followed him, her designer heels clicking hollowly on the pavement. Madison stood by her truck, her venture capitalist dreams reduced to a pile of debt and a tarnished reputation. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that I'd stopped playing along. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. I moved to a mountain ranch in Colorado, a place where the only auditors are the eagles, and the only deadlines are the sunsets. The air here is thin and clean, devoid of the suffocating scent of expensive perfume and corporate betrayal. I spend my days behind a different kind of lens now, capturing the raw, unscripted beauty of the wilderness. My net worth of $12,500,000 is no longer a target. It is a shield and a source of life. I established the David Harrison Foundation for Disenfranchised Seniors, using the funds I reclaimed to provide legal and financial protection for those whose families view them as line items to be erased. Not because it makes me look charitable, but because I know firsthand that the most dangerous prison is the one built by the people who claim to love you. Madison reached out to me recently. She didn't ask for money, she asked for a conversation. She admitted she had been a pawn in Joshua's game, a willing participant in a narrative she didn't fully understand until the ledger was closed. I didn't invite her to the ranch. I told her that trust is an investment that must be earned through years of consistent, independent performance. I'm giving her the same gift I gave myself, the opportunity to rebuild her own life without my capital. I've come to realize that there are two types of justice in this world. Most people focus on the justice of punishment, the satisfaction of seeing the walls crumble and the villains fall. But as I watch the seeds I've planted in my new life begin to break through the soil, I understand the justice of the seed sower. True revenge is not the destruction of your enemies. It is the construction of a life so beautiful and meaningful that their existence becomes an irrelevant shadow in your peripheral vision. If you find yourself in a similar situation, caught in a gilded cage or treated like an asset to be managed, remember that your value is not a rented commodity. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free and clear the space for your own rebirth. You have the power to be the architect of your own peace. If this story reminded you that your worth is not defined by those who try to dim your light, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Don't forget to subscribe to our community for more stories of quiet strength and absolute justice. Keep your boundaries firm and always be the one who decides your own trajectory.